You know, not everyone who says they're a Christian is actually following Jesus. You encounter this all the time, especially here in America. You know, it could be somebody that's at your work who says they follow Jesus, or but they're really not. It could be even somebody like a big time preacher who has a huge congregation and has all these books that are written and are known as a pastor. It's very common to find people, especially here in America, in our everyday life, in our schools, in our work, who claim the title of Christian, but in reality, they aren't actually doing what a Christian's supposed to do. They're not actually following Christ. So I wanted to give you a few warning signs that can help you see if somebody who is claiming to be a Christian really is following Jesus, or if they're just claiming that title but aren't really doing what they say they're doing. And we find these in Psalm chapter 50. Psalm chapter 50, verse 16 says, "But to the wicked God says, what right have you to tell of my statutes and to take my covenant in your mouth?" So in Psalm 50, verse 16, God is speaking to people, and he says, hey, there's these people, he calls them the wicked, which in the Old Testament times, in the book of Psalms, that describes anybody who's not following God. So he says, hey, there's the wicked, who are people who aren't following God. And they're characterized first by saying that they are following God's statutes and they have a covenant relationship with God. So this isn't a sign, but it's just to let us know the setting of what we're talking about, that even thousands of years ago, there was people who said they were following God's statutes of the Bible, who claimed to have a relationship with God. But from God's perspective, he says, no, you're just wicked. You're somebody that doesn't follow me. So what are these warning signs that he gives us, these characteristics of these people who talk about God's statutes and talk about God's covenant relationship, but really are just blowing smoke? Well, he says in verse 17, "For you hate discipline and you cast my words behind you." So the first warning sign there is they cast God's word behind you. You know, there are a lot of people that claim to be Christians, but to them, the Bible is not inerrant. The Bible is not God's authority. The Bible is just something that men wrote giving their ideas about God. And so they feel like they can take pieces of it and cast it away. And God says, be careful of that. Be careful of those people who claim to be Christians, but can feel like they can cast God's word behind them, like it's irrelevant or it's not for authority for them today. Secondly, he says in verse 18, "When you see a thief, you are pleased with him, and you associate with idolaters." In other words, the second warning sign is that they tolerate or maybe even celebrate things that God calls sin. He says, when you see a thief, you're pleased with them, and you associate with idolaters. Now, this can be maybe somebody who is hesitant to say that a sin that the Bible calls a sin is a sin, or hesitant to really speak up to somebody who's doing that, all the way to the other extreme, which is people who claim to be Christians, who are actually celebrating things that the Bible bluntly says is a sin. Things like, it says idolatry, things like thieving, things like homosexuality, things like transgenderism, about like greed, all these things, and celebrating them that God says we shouldn't celebrate. We should actually say for what they are. So those are the first two warning signs. He says they cast God's word behind them. They celebrate what God calls a sin. Third, he says they speak words, then they talk lies, and they use curse words, and their mouth is filthy, in other words. It says, "And you let your mouth loose in evil, and your tongue frames deceit." So Jesus would say later in the book of Matthew, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. So you can kind of tell, maybe watch their language, watch what kind of words they use, watch the way they interact and speak to and about other people, because that can be a warning sign that maybe somebody who claims to be a Christian is not really following Jesus very well. And then lastly, he says inside verse 21, "These things you have done, I have kept silent. You thought that I was just like you. I will reprove you and state the case in order before your eyes." So this last warning sign is that they try really hard to make God like them. And the thing is, God's not like us. You know, the more, in fact, the closer to get to God you get, the more you realize that God's not like you. The more holy you realize he is, the more bigger you realize he is, the more good he is when you realize you're not good. And so the desire, the people who work really hard to try to convince people that God is just like them, that might be a warning sign that maybe they're trying to make God be what they want God to be instead of just acknowledging God for who he really is and following God for who he really is. So what do we do about this? You got these warning signs, casting God's word behind you, celebrating things the Bible calls sin, using language and talking bad about people, trying to make God be just like them. How do we respond to that? Well, there's two ways to respond. It's in 22 and 23. It says, "Now consider this, you who forget God, or I will tear you in pieces and there will be none to deliver. He who offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving honors me, and to him who orders his way aright, I shall show the salvation of God." So there's two ways to respond to this information. First, he says, heed the warning that, as he says, to those who forget God, heed God. Come to the realization that we're not trying to follow a God of our own creation. We're not trying to make the Bible mean what we want it to mean, but to just follow God for who he is. And heed the warning that he says that if we refuse to accept Jesus and follow God, that he says that there's no deliverance for them. So that's the first reaction, is heed the warning. The second reaction we should do is accept the salvation that God does give us. He says, to him orders his way right, he'll show the salvation of God. The good news is that God knows that we're all sinners. And he knows that because of that, we all are condemned because of our sin. And that's why Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to earth 2,000 years ago. And he went to the cross, and when he went to the cross, he paid that penalty for your sin and mine, so that now to order our way right, to get that salvation from God, we don't make God what we want him to be, and we don't even try to work really hard to be good people. It's all about surrendering our lives to Jesus, placing our trust completely in Jesus to save us. And when you do that, the rest of it falls in line because you're so thankful of the love and mercy that God has shown you. When you see the love and mercy of God for what it really is, when you see what Jesus means on the cross, then all those other things will just slide right in place. And so if you're here today and you're so thankful for what Jesus did, for the mercy and salvation that God has bestowed upon us, hit that like button, share this video. Or if you're here today and you've been trying to make it on your own, and you've been trying to create God in your own liking, and you've heard today about Jesus Christ, you want to learn more about Jesus, comment below, message me. I'd love to talk to you more about that.